of history, while we're doubling down, tripling down, trying to teach our children British history, American history, and then separately African American history. And so, there were lots of my clients who were just exhausted, that this, between the pandemic, the political stuff going on, the murder, quite frankly, of George Floyd, the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, the murder of Breonna Taylor, like that it hit so close to home for us that we do pay. We pay in loss of sleep. We pay in other health side effects. So, when we are sublimating, when we're pushing all these emotions down, it leads us to other unhealthy behaviors. It leads us to drinking more. It leads us to weight gain. It leads us to hypertension. That cost is triple fold on us.
Yeah, I mean, even when you talked about like your kids and the privilege to shield certain children from the truth. When I was moving down to Georgia in 2015, I said to my daughter, who was in kindergarten at the time, I said, your school that you're going to go to it's a little bit more diverse. And she said, well, what does that mean? I said, more white people, more Black people, more people of various different backgrounds will all be in school together, and you're going to benefit from that. And she said to me, but, white people don't always like Black people. And I said, well, Maya, yes, there are some instances of that. But, I had sort of, as a parent, I almost had bought into this, but President Obama was a Black man and things have changed. And she, in kindergarten, said, but what about Ruby Bridges? And I said, well, baby, that was a long time ago. And she said to me, but what about these other things that have been on the news about things that are going on to Black students, in school? And this was kindergarten. And this wasn't even something that I had really sought out to teach her about, but she lived as a Black child in America. She experienced her Blackness even at the age of 5. And she was informed enough to know that things are different. And again, it's because of those microaggressions that we even see our children experiencing at their age. So, and going back to Nadia, you had talked about voting and politics. In 2013, the Supreme Court heard a case, Shelby versus Holder, and what they were attempting to do was strike down a portion of the Voting Rights Act. And in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court struck down Section 4, or a portion of it, and they said it's because when Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, they had relied on data showing that there were these disparate outcomes as it relates to Black individuals in the South and their right to vote. And so the Supreme Court says in 2013, but that's 40 years old. That data is old. And it's no longer responsive to our community needs. And what happened? After 2013, you had a bunch of states, Georgia included, who turned right around and changed their voting laws in a way that disenfranchised Black voters. And then you had organizations such as Black Voters Matter that we've partnered, that the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority has partnered with. And we've gone into these low voter turnout communities and areas, and you're talking with voters and you realize it's not that they don't care about issues. It's not that they don't care about what is happening to our communities. It's because, as Dr. Brown said, they've been denied the right to participate. They maybe couldn't take off and sit in a line for 4 or 5 hours to cast the ballot, or they did it, they cast the ballot, and then in 2020, the Georgia legislature passed the bill that's making it even more difficult and would criminalize. We are talking about criminalizing volunteers who would pass out water. What kind of evil society are we that we would not want to encourage volunteers to pass out food and water to people standing in line for 12 hours to vote? It is crazy. I mean, and again, you're not going to look us in the eye and tell us, as Black people who are experiencing our Blackness, when we each and every time we attempt to go and vote, that was done in a way that was race neutral.
Yeah.
It
I
was.
mean, it's interesting in this post-racial environment that data is still showing that adults and children as young as 8, um, up to 70% of adults report experiencing racial stressors daily, and at least 90% experience racial stressors at least on a weekly basis. So, as much as our culture at large would like to say, oh, we're acknowledged we're in a better place than we were in 1960. And then you look up at the end of 2020 and it looks a lot like 1960 all over again. And so I think building on that continued progress, but it can be very exhausting for us. It can lead to anxiety, it can lead to depression, the level of fighting that we have to do, and rolling up our sleeves. But that's why even going back to giving yourself permission sometimes, checking in with yourself and giving yourself permission to tap out, and even utilizing white allies who are willing to carry the torch a little bit, and really, utilizing other people who have it right now. But sometimes we can't, this is a marathon, and we can't run a marathon at a sprinter's pace. So we have to take care of ourselves, take care of our families, and make sure that we are refueling ourselves so that we are here to continue to fight the good fight.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point that you talk about in terms of how to utilize allies, or as some people, I like to call them co-conspirators, right? Because an ally, you're going to get in the struggle with us, stand right next to us. Because when we were marching, and there was this one particular young organization, and when I say young organization and young folk, I'm talking about 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds. And they were organizing using social media. So they would just pick a time and a place and meet up. They didn't get permits, they weren't worried about getting permits. And so whenever, some of us who were legal observers would hear where they were going to be, we would go out there as legal observers, trying our best to protect their right to vote, to observe. And then one thing I noticed was when there were uncomfortable exchanges with law enforcement, I would see our white co-conspirators going to the front of the line, putting their bodies between the Black protesters and law enforcement to provide that cover. And I thought, you know what, that's right. Use your privilege for protection and not oppression. So you're right. Sometimes we have to know when to, as Black folk, to take a step back for our mental health, and quite frankly, for our freedom in that instance, because they were not arresting those white co-conspirators, but they were going to start arresting those Black folk. So yeah, and and in terms of the politics of it, after 2020, with the massive voter turnout, particularly in minority communities, it is sometimes hard to get certain voters to the polls, but those voters showed up and showed out in 2020. And we know here in the state of Georgia what happened, right? We turned Georgia blue. We elected not one, but 2 Democratic senators, and Senator Warnock and Jon Ossoff. And again, we were rewarded with Senate Bill 202. But it wasn't just Georgia. The Brennan Center for Justice looked at in October of this year just how many states had passed or were attempting to pass restrictive or new restrictive voting laws, and there were at least 19 states that had passed 33 separate laws, right? And of course, we're talking about Georgia, Texas, and our neighbors to the south, good old Florida. Florida's on Florida, but again, it just goes to show that the reward for the great work we did was more oppression. And that sometimes can also, lead to hopelessness. It's like, we're doing all of this, we're sacrificing so much. I know I definitely sacrificed time with my children, with my activism. And And I'm doing it to leave this world a better place for them and for everybody else's children. But it does sometimes, it leads to hopelessness, because it's like, oh, here we go. Now we got to, get back out there in the streets. There's never a down moment, or at least it feels like there's never a real down moment where we can just let our hair down and breathe and live. And it's like there's the cost that we pay just for being Black.
Thank you. And you're both right about that. What would be the time for us to regroup, in terms of taking care of ourselves, spending time with our family? Would it be during the in-between election season moments, or, in the moments where there aren't any political unrest happening because of racial acts by law enforcement? Right now in this moment, the holiday season, the holiday time is taken over as the forefront. But we saw what happened last year when January came back around, and there was a difference in the political unrest of the group that charged the Capitol, and that caused a lot of stress and strife, to see the possibility that other decisions can be made. I know that I myself was wondering, will the reaction be the same? And of course it wasn't. And that, just taking in that stress and taking in all of the confirmation that no matter, or at least the thought that no matter what I might do for myself, or what I might do to teach my children to how to respond to police officers or people of authority, that really the bottom line is going to be based on how the other person is accepting or is not accepting of the color of my child's skin. So how do we recognize when we need a break? Is it something internal? I know that Dr. Brown, you mentioned basically listening to your body, paying attention to your behaviors related to sleep or hypertension. What are some ways that we can better be in tune to know when we need to stop, even though we still have the passion, even though we still want to be involved and make a contribution towards a fight that maybe inches us along the way? Maybe we'll have some setbacks. And how do we maintain our mental health in the best, and our self-care in the best possible way?
I think, even just going back to that self-awareness, and when you recognize those changes in yourself, give me just a second. I'm going to pass it over to Sharice.
Yeah, so I mean, here's what I do, right? And this is my non-medical advice. When you need to take a step back. When you're exhausted. For me, I started to get sick, like physically sick. I had run myself down, and my mother was still alive at the time. And she would say to me, I was headed out one day, I had my little bullhorn, I was headed out to protest, and I'm just, hacking, coughing. And she said, you need to go and be still. That's what our grandmothers used to tell us. You need to get somewhere, sit and be still, and let your body heal. And I actually did. I turned around that day. I went back in the house. I laid down because I realized that I was going to be good to no one if I ended up in a hospital somewhere because I did not listen to my body. One of the other things that I'll say is I learned to call in Black. And what does that mean? That means when that jury verdict was coming out in the trial against those officers who murdered, or the officer who murdered George Floyd,
Right.
I took leave that afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
I took sick leave, you have annual leave, or whatever it is your job calls it. use that leave on those days. I refuse to go to work with and experience trauma.
Right.
And this is how I knew I wasn't going to experience trauma for a non-Black audience. And this is how I knew, because that particular day we were on pins and needles, like all my friends texting each other or social media on pins and needles about that verdict, because in the back of our minds and in the pit of our stomach, we were all unsure of what that verdict was going to be.
Absolutely.
We had hope, but we also know to expect to be disappointed almost each and every time. And so there was that anxiety building up. And I was talking to a coworker, and they said, "Oh, Sharice, you don't sound like yourself." No, how am I supposed to be? Do you understand what's going on? And the response was, "Oh, I didn't realize that was happening today." I said, "You know what, Sharice, take leave, because those are also some microaggressions, right? The unintentional ones.
Absolutely.
That there are major things happening to Black people in this country collectively. And yes, George Floyd was all of our sons that day when he called out for his mother. He was all of our fathers that day when his daughter was asking how she was going to live her life without her father. And so we experienced that collectively as a people. So when that verdict was coming out, when the verdict was coming out just a couple of weeks ago in the Ahmaud Arbery case,
Yes.
and we saw that man get on that stand with them crocodile tears
Yes.
and tell us that he had to defend himself. We were gaslit throughout that trial. That lawyer, our lawyer who stood up and asked for Black pastors to be put out of the courtroom as if their presence alone, the presence of Black pastors, was going to influence the jury. That is absolutely ludicrous and ridiculous, but we experienced those microaggressions as a people. And I refuse, even though I still work from home, I refuse to experience that with individuals or co-workers who are going to pretend as if it was not happening to Black people and was not happening to society. So I took leave. So that's my advice, my non-medical advice. Take leave when you're going through these things. Call in Black if you need to.
But I like your point, Sharice, about, see it coming, like mark it on the calendar that, when that verdict is going to come in, make sure that you're in a space that allows you for a certain level of sanctity and safety. One of the things that we were talking about is recognizing those changes within yourself, right? Like when that your shoulders you're wearing your shoulders like earrings, and you're not sleeping well, and you're starting to act out, and you're not exercising, and you're not kind of staying with those practices that are good for your body. I think that's the first cue. When you see, like, I'm acting different, I'm changing, I need to do something about this, I need to push back. I think the separate thing that Sharice really highlighted well is, when you hear it from other people around you, when your children are like, "Mom, why are you been so mean lately?" Or "Why are you so irritated?" Or you're with your spouse and your spouse feels like you're short, or your coworkers or your mother or your sisters or your sorors call you out on, "Hey, you're not doing the things that you're usually doing. What's going on with you?" To even use that as an opportunity to kind of check in with yourself and to hear that they're seeing changes in you. And perhaps that's a time to step back. I do a lot of work with Delta Airlines. And so I talk a lot about the importance of putting the mask on yourself first. So why do you put the mask on yourself first? It's because if you don't take care of you, you won't be here to take care of other people. So the most loving thing that you can do as daughters, church members, mothers, sisters, is to take care of yourself so that you are here later on when someone else needs you. But we cannot pour from an empty cup. So it is the most selfless thing that you can do, is to take care of yourself so that you are here to fight the good fight, to help others, to be a part of things. And I think the other thing that I really wanted to go back to is that we can't do all of this all the time. Like, as individuals, as much of a superwoman as Sharice is, she cannot carry all of this on her back. And so for us to feel comfortable saying, "You know what? I need to sit on the sidelines for a minute. I need to regroup. I need to take a break." But we don't want to lose momentum, so making sure that we are passing the torch on to somebody else and saying, "I can't run this leg of the sprint. Sis, brother, do you have it? Can you run this leg? And I'm going to pull back for a month. I'm going to be sitting on a beach somewhere, reading a book with a cocktail in my hand, and I'm going to refuel myself so I can come back and continue with this work and continue to have an impact in our communities.
Absolutely. And we have a couple of questions that came in through the chat. Sharice, you touched on this. And so we have a question related to what advice would you give minorities that commonly work in predominantly white spaces regarding not becoming resentful or bitter towards their white counterparts for the difference in privilege, perspective, and power that they are given? You both actually touched on this, but what would you say? Sharice said, you know, you take your time that you have, but any other suggestions in that space? Should you respond? Should you take those moments to educate? Is it even worth the energy or effort to do that?
I think you have to know who you're dealing with. My grandmother and my mother used to tell us all the time, consider the source, right? You know the people who are intentionally engaging in inappropriate behavior toward Black people in the workplace. And you know, when they do and say certain things, they're hoping to bait you into a discussion. One thing I had to come to a realization towards, particularly being a manager in the federal government, is I'm not going to debate my humanity with anybody in a workplace. I'm not going to do it. Now, there are some times where there are instances for education. Yes. For example, I've had colleagues who may say things like, oh, we're going to put up a Chinese wall, or I'm the low man on the totem pole. And because I work in a federal environment where the work that I do is dealing with discrimination laws, Title VII, I will correct those things to say, hey, you know, again, not in an aggressive manner, and I try to do it privately. Hey, that's really not appropriate to say in the workplace. And then I'll explain why. I've had to spend a lot of time educating my team and some of my coworkers on use of the term first world problems and why that's inappropriate. So there are some instances where you can go in and educate, but when it comes to somebody trying to bait me in, I'm not going to do that. And at the end of the day, you have the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for those in the federal sector. And then, you know, the EOC also works with certain private sector employees who are covered by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. That said, that I don't have to be subjected to these microaggressions in the workplace. That's harassment. If you are being subjected to unwanted, unwelcome conduct based on your membership in a protected class, that is unlawful. Right? And if it's impacting your ability to perform your official duties or your duties, it's actionable. So we as you know, as a people, we have to learn. And as my mother would say, consider the source, consider the person. Is this an opportunity to educate somebody because they truly don't know? Or based on your history with that individual, are they trying to bait you into a race-related conversation in the workplace? Don't debate your humanity. That's when you exercise your rights as it relates to filing a complaint if it rises to that level, or you report it to HR or to management so that they can step in and take action before it becomes severe and pervasive in the work environment. Or in some instances, you're just going to call in Black and say, not today, Karen, I'm not going there with you. So that's my
and I would even add, you know, just like recognizing both your boundaries and not apologizing for those boundaries. Like, boundaries are in place to keep everyone safe, and knowing that it's okay for you to say, this isn't a conversation that I'm willing to engage in, or I don't have the capacity. You know, if it's someone who's coming to you and they're not being malicious, the part where I'm most sensitive is I know, you know, I've worked in majority white environments where I know these people were not educated. They were not properly educated because they didn't get all the information. They got a redacted version of history, and that they believe that to be true. They don't read books. They just watch Fox News. That's where they get all their information from. But sometimes they really want to know. They really want to hear a different perspective. So for me to not feel like I have to stand there and teach all of history correctly, but to refer them. Like, if you really want to know, here's a list of books that are out there. if you are truly curious, if you truly want to educate yourself on a different perspective. Something very interesting that happened to me in 2016 was during Trump's inauguration. I was at work. I had no intention of watching that inauguration. I go into a meeting and they turn the inauguration on. And I sat there for a moment, and of course, I'm the only Black person at the table. I sat there for a moment and I thought, this isn't good for me. This isn't where I want to be. This isn't productive. This has nothing to do with the work that we're doing. So what I said to them was, hey, I'm going to go back to my desk and work for a little while. When you guys are ready to commence the meeting, give me a call and I'll come back down and we'll talk about work. We'll talk about oncology. But I think those are those moments where we have to recognize that it might be a toxic or unhealthy environment for us, and it's okay to leave. You know, we can be gracious. We don't have to flip tables. We don't have to set the room on fire. But recognizing that my health is my responsibility to take care of, and I don't have to keep myself in a toxic environment.
Thank you both for that. We have a part two to that question in relation to microaggressions in the workplace and responding when you want to assert yourself as an advocate for minorities, for Black people. How do you do that without being aggressive or being perceived to be aggressive? And I think that is a delicate balance that Black women, unfortunately, we have to hold.
Yeah, because the reality is you could go in as quiet as a church mouse and you may still be perceived as aggressive just by virtue of the subject matter on which you are speaking and advocating. You know, we live in a society, whether we want to, well, whether certain segments of the society want to acknowledge it or not, we still live in a very oppressed society. And so when you start talking about equaling the playing field for Black folk, guess what that means you're actually doing for